On today's episode of Survival Dispatch News, tangible tips to use in specific urban survival scenarios. All right, everybody, and welcome back to another special edition of Survival Dispatch News, which has really turned into a survival podcast. We've been listening to you guys. You're telling us what you want to know about, and we're trying real hard to bring you some really tangible urban survival information, because that's what you asked for. You want that urban survival stuff, and that's what we're doing today. So we want to welcome you back, and welcome back one of our self-defense and concealed carry experts, Sal De Janeiro. Welcome back to the show, Sal.
Thanks for having me back, Denny.
You bet. Now, our folks have asked us to expound a bit on situational awareness and really provide them with some tangible information as it pertains to urban survival. And God knows, and everybody knows, there's a lot of crazy crap happening in the world right now, right, Sal? It's just nuts, isn't it?
Oh, it is no question. But interestingly, it seems to be themes that cyclically repeat themselves. So while there's just a lot of it right now, it's not necessarily anything new.
True that. It's interesting to see how things come sometimes even full circle about this. But I digress. We've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to take the situational awareness issue to a whole new level. We're going to talk about some tangible things. But at the end of our conversation, I want our viewers to be able to say, hey, I learned this, and this. And let's just jump right into it. Situational awareness, being able to identify threats. And I had a conversation prior to the taping of our podcast today. And let's remind folks how to recognize potential threats out there as it pertains to people, what they look like, what they're wearing, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. A general understanding general principles of self-awareness are going to factor into recognizing any threats in our environment, whether we're talking about this increasing era of threats from terrorism or just more mundane crime, right? It's all really similar principles as far as noticing things, being aware. To make things actionable, I'll share with you a formula that I've used for a long time, trying to teach awareness, because it's a mindset issue. So obviously it's harder to teach somebody, what is awareness? What is situational awareness? A very simple formula I give people is anytime you enter a new space, do a quick checklist of 4 things. When you, for example, I use the example everybody can relate to. You walk into a fast food restaurant, right? As soon as you walk in, look around and notice 4 things. Who's in there and what are they doing, right? Where are your exits? Where is the most likely point of criminal activity? And that's usually the cash registers, right? And the 4th thing is what could provide cover in the environment if things kick off. So it's a very easy checklist to go through. Who's in there and what are they doing? Where are your exits? What's the most likely point of criminal focus? And what could provide cover? And if you at least take note of those things, you're much more likely to be able to walk right out if you see trouble transpiring. Many incidents have transpired where people have actually walked into a place with a robbery already in progress, and they don't even notice it until they're caught up right in it, right? If you walk into a place and things look bad, go eat at another restaurant. It's that simple. So if nothing else, when we talk about all these things about situational awareness, we can go so deep when it comes to specific threats. But that's just a checklist I throw out to people because it is transitional spaces where most crime actually happens. When you're in a parking lot, right? We all make fun of the Walmart parking lot. It's, the watering hole on the Serengeti plain, right? Where all the predators come in. Well, notice what's going on around you and just go through that quick checklist when you are transitioning spaces into a new place or in the parking lot, etc. And that alone goes a long way.
Yeah, talking about transitioning spaces, and you were talking about parking lots and cars. I can't help think about the protests and the mobs and the folks that are mobbing the cars, and the terror that those people in those vehicles must be feeling, and maybe they don't know what to do and things. I really like to get back to that because that is a really pertinent, timely thing to talk about right now. I think we can talk extensively about that. But we all go to restaurants, we all go shopping. What about some of these larger areas we go to? What should we look for, in the airport? What should we look for in a larger space, Sal?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the larger the space, obviously, the more that can transpire without us seeing it. So again, coming back to the theme that a lot of us are concerned about currently, which is unfortunately a heightened threat of terrorism, thanks to having a wide open southern border, and that is literally the issue. Now, with that said, there's always the potential of, which we've seen many times, just domestic people carry out mass attacks, right? And we have that the problem with the terrorist threat from foreign actors is it's likely to look different than that more typical active shooter paradigm. So thinking in terms of these things, some of the things you would want to look out for are means by which people would infiltrate public locations to do harm. One thing you always want to be aware of is unusual, unseasonal, heavy clothing. And
Right.
in fact, again, this goes beyond just, terror threat. This is criminals do this very often. If it's 95 degrees, in Chicago in July and somebody walks in wearing a coat, that's usually a bad sign, right?
Yeah, they're
So
trying to hide something, obviously.
exactly right.
Yeah.
It is to conceal tools. So you always want to be on the lookout for that in general. But if you start thinking in terms of how does that play into the heightened terror threat, obviously, if you have multiple people who are walking in doing that, if they look rather well coordinated with each other in that regard, dressed in a similar sense, carrying large backpacks. Obviously, explosives or long guns can be hidden in backpacks. And again, we don't have to go out on the limb of potential terror attacks to see exactly that. The active shooter who was stopped by Eli Dickens in the mall, he went into the restroom before he started the attack with the pack. Another shooter who did that comes to mind was the Florida high school shooting. He went
Yeah.
into the restroom first to pull out the rifle. And there's been numerous times where actually they've assembled a rifle going into the restroom before the shooting starts because they might have the lower and the upper of an AR, for example, taken apart so it can fit in an actual backpack. Okay, so these are the kind of things to be on your mental radar. If you see a guy who walks into a public restroom with a backpack and he's not acting right. And I mentioned that because backpacks are commonplace, right? But
Yeah.
usually when these people are about to go through with an act like this, there's something off about them. Obviously, you're going to pick up on the body language. And if you see that, take that into account by either getting out of there, or let's say you're in a public place and you see this happen and you have family members scattered around that place. You can't herd everybody out quickly. You know what I would do? I'd follow him into the restroom and see what he does. And if he starts putting together a rifle, he is in for a rude awakening,
Ah,
right?
okay.
So these are things to consider. If you don't have the option to clear out,
Yep.
the best thing would be short circuit that real fast. Don't even let him come out of the restroom with it, right? It should be very obvious what he's up
Yeah.
to if he puts together a rifle. Okay, so
Yeah.
those are the kind of things to bear in mind. Beyond that, the explosives issue, which again, this is a very terrifying thing to talk about, but if we're talking in terms of possible terrorism, bear in mind those bags could have explosives. What we have seen throughout Asia, throughout the Middle East, and throughout Europe multiple times is terrorists may be wearing explosive devices on person. So if you see somebody dressed in a way they look unusually bulky, that sort of thing, this is something to be unfortunately cognizant of. There may be explosives on body the individual may be wearing. And while it's a brutal subject to talk about, if it comes to shooting, if it becomes a shooting problem, this is the kind of threat that may not be out of the game just because they've hit the ground, right?
Right.
For example, think of the terrorist attack in the Istanbul airport. Those Turkish cops handled that really heroically. They did a fantastic job. And I don't know if you've ever seen the video, Denny, of the one suicide bomber. He was an active shooter, but he was wearing an explosive vest. The cop who shot him to the ground came running over to him and realized he's trying to detonate an explosive and ran to get out of the room there. It was like near a baggage carousel. And unfortunately, that cop did not make it out. So this is the kind of thing that now is a heightened threat that we have to think about, because the domestic active shooter is a different thing. Not to say they've not tried some of this stuff. I remind everybody the Columbine High School attackers actually planted explosives, and going into the high school and shooting everybody was plan B. The detonators on their bombs did not work. They failed. So, it's been done, but it is simply
Yeah, we
it's
forget
not
about
done
that
as
part.
often, right? It's
Yeah.
yeah, but if we're looking at foreign international actors who have illegally infiltrated our border, who are here, we're much more likely to see explosives and those kind of tactics used.
Right. So we talk about individuals, recognizes those threats from individuals, the terrorist situation. I want to go a whole different direction here. Watching the news, finding out what's going on, protests everywhere,
Mhm.
everywhere you look. I don't care where you are, even if you're out in the heartland of the country, conservative part of the country. If you're anywhere near a university, you're going to find a protest somewhere. And we have seen these protests turn into terrifying situations for people in vehicles. And we've got video. Matter of fact, I'm going to show some video in just a couple of minutes. And you've probably already seen it. I know our viewers have already seen it from Washington State, where a mob surrounded a vehicle. And you can only imagine the terror in that person. Let's just do that. We're going to go kind of analog here. I've got it up on my computer screen. We're going to pan around to this video here and show you and our viewers this video. Here we go. And then we can go back and analyze it a bit as well, Sal. Can you imagine what that person is feeling right now in that car, surrounded by all those people? I believe this is a pro-Palestine protest. They've blocked the entire highway, as you can see. You see him start to get out of his car, and immediately I thought, oh no, that's not good, right? And so on and so forth. So let's speak to that a little bit, Sal, and give me your 2 cents worth on that. First off, let's go back a little bit and talk about how can we avoid being in that situation altogether.
Yeah, which obviously is the best case scenario, is avoiding it, right? So this is the latest wave of protests we're seeing. Thus far, they've been more peaceful than what we saw in 2020. So that's good, but that can change, obviously, right? But it's these are the current protests you might see: pro-Palestine, pro-Israel protest. For the past couple of years, you've seen things as ridiculous as climate protest, where people are
Right.
doing the same tactic, closing
That
down
turned
highways.
violent. Yeah,
Yes,
they end
that
up
turned
turning
violent, right? And of course, in 2020, we saw the big protest after the George Floyd killing. Circa 2018, I can't even remember what the issue at that time was. We were seeing similar things in different cities. So the issue becomes that even if the topic is not necessarily sinister, there are bad actors that love to take advantage of big crowds, right? And the truth is, even in the 2020 protests, which were among the most violent we've seen in decades in this country, um, you know, even in those protests, the majority of people are not bothering anybody on the streets, but it is absolutely a playground for bad actors. I'll bring everybody's memory back to the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting. The three guys he shot that night were all convicted felons, right? So, think about that. What are three white convicted felons doing on the street for a Black Lives Matter protest? I don't think those guys are there doing their civic duty about equality or anything like that, right? So this is the kind of people that any kind of protest can bring out, even if they're not in any way passionate about whatever the cause may be, right?
Oh,
So
you bet. Yeah,
yeah.
they'll infiltrate the crowds. They're the
Mhm.
folks that are looking for that excuse to for anarchy
Yes. Yep.
and violence.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep. And now as citizens, especially as armed citizens, this is something you have to be really cognizant about, because the way that these modern protests are, if you are threatened during a protest, it is most probable that it is only a single, perhaps a few individuals within a very big crowd that are actually the threat. It's not the whole crowd itself. And as far as a use of force, that's a very, very important thing to take into consideration, right? But to your
right.
point, Denny, you don't want to get there, right? We don't want to be anywhere even close to having to worry about use force to protect ourselves in such a horrible situation. So awareness and avoidance, when we talk about awareness for crowds, let me first throw this out there. This is actually a personal experience that's pretty crazy, just from about 4 or 5 months ago. It was from like early summer this year. I was actually at a business meeting in a particular city, and a protest broke out at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, which was right next to where I was, because the Prime
Oh boy.
Minister of Bangladesh was giving a speech there. And a couple hundred people showed up to protest that, and it got heated, and a number of people were arrested. So, needless to say, that was not on my radar. How would I even have thought of the Prime Minister of Bangladesh is going to be right in close proximity to where I am, and it's going to draw a protest? So, my
Right.
point with that is I didn't get caught in it. I saw it from afar and gave it a wide berth, right? But my point with it is avoidance is the best thing to do, but you may literally find yourself at ground zero like that, right?
Yeah.
It
True.
can happen so
Yeah.
quick. And it might be something that you're not seeing, you're not hearing talk about it on the radio. There's nothing really planned, it just happens. Another example I would give is when I was about eight, 18, 19 years old, I was at a concert that turned violent so quickly, it was staggering. Even back then, being a young, dumb kid, I was smart enough not to go close to the stage. It was a regional concert for all regional heavy metal bands. And I mean like heavy, heavy metal bands. So what do
Okay.
you have? You have 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are drinking because just let's say, late 90s, in the southern state where I was living, they weren't, too strict about their drinking policy, So there's a couple thousand young guys in a small club, and the first band refused to play because the crowd was getting violent, and that place exploded. I mean,
Wow.
I couldn't even believe it. There's bottles flying everywhere. I was
Oh
friends with
boy.
one of the bouncers. The next weekend, he was telling me that four of their bouncers had to go to the hospital. That's
Holy
how
cow.
crazy it got.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I got my back to a wall and got out a fire exit really quick. So after you've seen things like that, though, you come to the conclusion that no matter how good you are about avoidance, you may get caught in something very quickly that can
Yeah.
transpire. So, with that said, let's talk about avoidance.
Yeah. For sure.
One of the best things you can do is, well, two things you can do. Keep a pulse, keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening politically in your vicinity. Okay,
Yeah.
so not only around your home, but around your place of employment or wherever you may be traveling. What's happening? Has there recently been a high profile police shooting or something like that, right? Is there political unrest going on like there is currently? Okay, be aware of
Yeah.
that. The other big one is know the hot spots around your home, your place of work, or your commute route. What are the hot spots? Those would be courthouses, county buildings, state buildings, police
Yep.
precincts. Okay,
Yep. Okay.
places that are likely to attract demonstration. Know what they are, and when things are riled up, give those locations a wide berth.
Yeah.
Take routes that put you far away from those. I was actually in Charlottesville, Virginia, right when the trial of the one guy who, during the protest of, it started as protest over pulling down statues, and then
Oh,
neo-Nazis
right.
showed
Yep.
up and marched, and then counter protesters showed up, and that's what started the fight.
Yep.
So long story short, a guy ran over a girl who was there. That guy was on trial. I was actually in
Yep.
Charlottesville, Virginia during the trial when the trial was about to wrap up. And I was there for business, and I had that on my radar. I said, depending on what this verdict is, you very well may see all hell break loose, because I was actually right near the courthouse where the trial was going on. So be aware of these things, right? Know what's
Yeah.
happening as far as the political landscape, and know where those potential hotspots are. They're going to be your state buildings, your police precincts, your courthouses. Give those places a wide berth.
Yeah. How in the world do we figure out how protesters choose certain roadways or intersections to block? We may not know, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yes, some protests are planned and we may hear about them or read about them on the news, right? But what about these pop-up protests? We may not know. So if we don't know, how do you reckon? Let's get to the nitty gritty. I'm in my car. I'm in my truck. I'm driving down the road. I got to get from point A to point B. I'm taking this route, taking a left here, taking a right here. How do I recognize potential problems up ahead of me?
Yeah, so if you see a traffic slowdown, if you look at these videos, like let's talk about the big highways. Like for example, the video you just played, this looks like a big interstate or a beltway somewhere, right? So
Yeah.
it's a big highway. You have 3 or 4 lanes of traffic, and it just stops. Now the problem with that is you are likely to be boxed in to the point where you can't move around.
Yeah.
One thing to bear in mind is just standard defensive driving can come in very useful here. For example, whenever you stop, do you leave enough room between you and the car in front of you that you
Very
can?
good point.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I just have to say this. I refuse to stop bumper to bumper with the vehicle in front of me for the sheer fact that I want an escape route. And I literally leave myself, I don't care where it is, or I'm just driving down to the grocery store. I literally leave enough room between my vehicle and the vehicle in front that I can turn and escape either one way or the other. I'm really glad you brought that up. So I don't know if people think about that. I think about it.
No, and that's a perfect point you make. And let me remind people that this is a strategy you should be using on a daily basis, right?
Yep.
Because what if you make a stop, if you're sitting on a beltway outside of a big city where traffic just stops, right? And the car in front of you, a couple guys get out with guns in their hand to carjack you. Well, if you leave that space, you can literally just move instead of have to go to force, right?
Right.
So if we look at a situation like this, if there's a slowdown up front and then you see big crowds in front of you, if you leave that space, you may have the option to turn and get to a lane. And this is going to be one of those times where you would never pull onto the side shoulder and drive the opposite of traffic. That'll land you in cuffs real fast. Well, in a situation like this might be one of those times where we bend the rules a bit here, right? So if you have the option to pull onto the shoulder and drive opposite of traffic, but it's going to get you away from this crowd, then it's going to be a pretty easy thing to explain afterwards why you did that. Likewise, if you're in an urban area, like in a downtown city, and you get caught in a crowd, if you have to drive over the sidewalk, etc., you're going to have to make those decisions and do things you would normally never do. But
Right.
this is going to be, much more explainable when you're able to say, hey, the reason I did that was I knew this crowd very well may be dangerous and I wanted to get out of the.
Yeah, I want to take a step back and get even more kind of nitty gritty, get in the dirt of this thing and talk about. I want to tell you some of the things that I do when I'm driving along, especially if I'm in an area that I'm not familiar with. My doors are locked, my windows are up, and I always feel like I should be prepped for worst case scenario. And I'm not paranoid. Call me paranoid if you will. but can I access my gear from the seated area in my vehicle? Can someone open my door from the outside? Nope, door's locked. I even go so far, you're going to laugh at me, Sal. I even go so far as to I use the recirculated air button in my truck so that if something happens outside, I'm not getting that outside air in on
I'm
me.
not
And
laughing because I do the same thing, and that will actually buy you a lot of time. For example, if there's tear gas or something like that, that
yep.
makes a huge difference.
I mean, half the time I just don't want to smell the diesel
Hmm.
fumes from the big truck in front of me. But if you think about it, it's just one more little thing that you can do. And going back to that driving down the road, something doesn't feel right. If it doesn't feel right, in my opinion, it's probably not right. If it doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. I'm going to really seriously thinking about changing my route, because if I look ahead and I see traffic, so I see lights, uh, stop lights up ahead, brake lights on my vehicles, and I know there's not an intersection there, I'm going to say, whoa, okay, let's evaluate what's going on here. And I'll look right, left, and maybe I need to take another route. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. Use applications on your phone like Google Maps or Waze that show you traffic slowdowns, and if you know things are going on where these kind of protests might erupt, that traffic slowdown might signify something other than a car wreck or construction,
Yeah.
right?
And
So
it's
you
human nature. We want to rubberneck. We want to see. We
Mhm.
want to investigate the unusual. It's just human nature. So to me, it seems like we got to fight that nature a little bit, right?
Oh, absolutely. You want to give this stuff a wide berth. So, like we were discussing, these things often can happen so fast and so unpredictably, you might simply find yourself there. But if you have any inclination it's happening, do not get curious, and decide you're going to get close and see what's going on. Give it a wide berth and don't be there.
Okay, let's talk about worst case scenario. We're in it. We get converged upon.
Hmm.
In the video, you see the door open, the guy's getting out. I had a heart attack. I'm like, no, this
Yeah.
dude's going to die.
Yep.
And I don't know how he got back in that vehicle. Thank goodness that he did, or that might have been the end of him, or he might have suffered some very serious physical injury to himself. But I am not getting out of my vehicle. I'm staying out of vehicles, because at that point, that's going to be your safest place, right?
Yeah, so you're going to need to read the situation. Now, a crowd like that didn't look particularly aggressive, and they might have gotten more aggressive to him because it looks like he had tried to drive further into them, right? So remember, you're going to frighten people who are on foot if you're looking like you're going to run them over. So even if you have people who are not being particularly aggressive, they'll get aggressive real fast if they think you're trying to run them down, right? So it's a very delicate balance we have to play. So here's a few things to consider. If you come to a complete standstill and you're surrounded by hundreds of people, but they're not being aggressive and they're just, chanting and waving around sides and walking past you, wait it out. Okay. Just like everybody else in their cars, wait it out. Do not push it. Don't try to run people over. The problem is if you find yourself in an event where people now are assaulting cars, which again,
Yep.
think back to 2020, was a very different scene than what we're seeing thus far. And again, hopefully right now what we're seeing stays relatively peaceful. But if we look at 2020 and 2018 and a few times over the past decade or so, um, again, you get those bad actors. It may not necessarily be the whole crowd. It's likely not, but you get guys who are there just to do damage. For example, I've seen videos where they're coming through shattering windows.
Right.
And that's a dangerous assault. If they shatter the window
Yeah,
in your
that's a
face.
whole different
Yep,
level,
absolutely.
from simple damage. And the question our viewers have, and that I have had, is, at what point do you start fighting back, and at what level
Hmm.
can you fight back? And we are not lawyers. Sal's not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Consult your local, legal experts in your area. But you cannot, if someone's just pounding on your vehicle, denting your vehicle, doing stuff, if you can't articulate that you are in fear for your life, how are you going to convince a jury if you pull your gun and shoot somebody that's just beating on your car? Because you're gonna end up doing time for that.
Yeah, no question. You have to get out of the mindset of protecting property, because this is no different than if somebody burglarizes your house and runs out the back door with your television and you shoot them in the back for the television. You cannot do that, right? So if you're in a crowd that is maybe getting a little bit hostile, but they're not acting overtly dangerous, and maybe, like, for example, one out of every 20 people who walks by kicks your bumper. Okay, that is not justification to get out and start shooting people, and it's not
Yeah.
justification to start running people over, right? But if you find yourself in a crowd that now gets overtly hostile, where they either are trying to shatter the glass or they're trying to flip the car over,
Oh
that's a
yeah.
whole different thing now at that
Yeah. If
point,
you're,
right?
yep. Yeah. But if you're
And
compromised to the
mhm.
point that they're trying to get to you, drag you out, your family members out, all bets are off in my book at that point.
Yes, absolutely. So that's overt use of deadly force. If they flip the car over, that's a deadly force threat. If they
Yep.
smash the windows out, that's a deadly force threat. So, um, getting out of the car should be your last your final decision, right? On
Yeah.
your decision tree. You want to use the car if you can, and if you need to actually drive through a crowd, think of it in terms of pushing through the crowd. And that's for
Yeah.
two reasons. First of all, again, we come back to most likely it's a small minority of people who are actually the bad actors in the crowd. So you don't want to go running over people who think they're just there, to have some kind of political protest, and they're not hurting anybody. The other thing to consider is if you hit an adult human being at full speed, you can disable your vehicle very fast, very
Mm-hmm.
quickly. Okay, so if you hit a human being going 50 miles an hour, that will most likely, unless you're driving something really large and robust, that will very likely disable the vehicle. It'll deploy the airbags, and now you've got a real problem. And the other problem
Yeah.
you're going to have is if you disable your vehicle in the middle of a crowd where you just ran a bunch of them over, they're
Yeah.
going to be angry, right? Even if it was
Yep.
something that was fairly peaceful, it's not going to be peaceful anymore. So these are things to think about. So you want to, if you have to drive through the crowd, move slow enough to push people out of the way, but hopefully not injure them. And the other thing is you have to be sure you're not injuring your vehicle to the point where now you're immobile. In fact, modern vehicles have sensors. Usually, if they sense some kind of impact, they kill the engine, the modern sensors. So
Yeah.
that's something to be cognizant as well. If you're driving anything relatively new, even if you just bump somebody with something that would do a little more than bend the fender a little bit, that
Yeah.
your engine might cut out on you.
Yeah, I want to back up just a little bit because you mentioned something that made me think about mob mentality. And I remember doing some research and studying about mob mentality. And even in a somewhat peaceful mob, the mentality often is that if one of those mob protester members becomes injured, often that mob mentality kicks in so that somewhat uh, quiet mob all of a sudden turns into a loud mob, which turns into an aggressive mob, which can turn into a violent mob. So I think am I right in thinking that,
No
Sal?
question. That's a known syndrome. It's a sociological syndrome that happens, and exactly what you're referring to, mob mentality. There's probably a more sophisticated medical term for it, but we can go with mob mentality. That's exactly right. Things will go down to the lowest common denominator very quickly, right? So even if you have people who on their own would never think of doing these kind of things, they get wrapped up in the moment. You might see people start to vandalize things who have no history of doing that just because other people in the mob are doing so. When it comes to violence against somebody in a car, what you're very likely to see is, again, you might have people who are generally peaceful, but if they got the sense that you're trying to run them over, they're going to be enraged. I mean, we would be
Yeah.
enraged, right? If
Even
we
though
thought,
even though they're in the wrong
yes,
place,
yeah,
doing illegal
absolutely.
things, they shouldn't be there in the
Mhm,
first place.
mhm.
They're still going to think that way.
Right, right. They might presume what really bothers me is when they close down highways, like the video you just showed, because people people have the right to protest and march down the street and do whatever as long as they're doing it peacefully. But when they close highways like that, they don't have the right to do that, and that terrifies people. The thing is, though, they may not really mean anybody any harm, but if you get an aggressive driver who plows through there, they will explode with rage very quickly, and you don't want to trigger that, right? We only want to use the vehicle forcefully to egress if we have no other choice.
Right, right. You bet. So I want to hit on EDC. I want to hit on gear because you mentioned that before, and I think that's a very important thing to think about. We really don't think about, can we reach our stuff if we're out of position? Can you reach your stuff if your seatbelt's on? Can you reach your stuff if you're upside down? Is your EDC gear on your person, or is it elsewhere in your vehicle? And what should that EDC gear be? I want to make sure that I've got my self-defense gear on my person. I want to make sure I've got my phone because that's my comms. I want to be able to call 911. Oh my, I'm in a protest. I turned my car over. I'm at the intersection of such and such. I'm in fear for my life. I'm armed. They're trying to pull me out, blah, blah, blah. Let's talk to that because that's some really nitty-gritty information.
Yeah, you hit on a really good point here. Having things on body. I will tell you from now, and maybe some people won't like hearing this. I am not a fan of having car holsters where when you get into the car, you take your gun off and put it somewhere. My suggestion is if you can't comfortably sit in your car with your gun on you, then change your carry position or the way you carry.
Yeah.
I love appendix carry, and one of the main reasons is the accessibility when you're sitting. But that's not to say strong side doesn't facilitate that as well. You will find with strong side hip, typically you have to do a pretty pronounced lean forward to access the gun, right? But you can practice it and certainly do it. But in general, keep your tools on body. And you hit on a great point here, Denny. This is a perfect example of that. If you have to get out of the vehicle, which again, we've already said that would be the last case scenario, but if you're at that last case scenario, your vehicle is immobilized and maybe a big crowd is coming towards you, you want to get out of there before it happens. You want those tools on body. The exception might be, your EDC bag, which over the past few years, I've become a big believer in that, right? A sling bag, and you could just have that in the seat next to you, throw that over your shoulder and you're out of there, right? So weapons on body, I'm a believer in medical on body, a tourniquet and those kind of things, and certainly in that EDC sling bag, right? Have these things on body ready to go so that if you have to get out quickly, it's all on you. And we could come back to the truck gun discussion. Here's a perfect example of where that might be a lot more of a liability than a benefit to you if you emerge from the vehicle with a long gun. I remind people, what are, for example, responding police? What are they going to be looking for when they get on scene? Right? A guy, all of a sudden, there's a guy in a hostile crowd running around with a rifle. You put a target on your back. My suggestion would be if you're going to have a long gun for these kind of considerations, have it in a pack. So that it's hidden in the pack so that when you get out of the vehicle, it's not exposed unless you need to take it out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfectly good sense. And we're going back to holster and holster choice. I love holsters that have adjustable features so that if I want to carry appendix in a situation, or if I want to change the angle so that I can carry over here at 4 o'clock maybe, or even a sort of a cross draw position, holsters like this give you the ability to do that. So I don't necessarily always carry in the same position all the time. What about you, Sal?
So I tend to always carry appendix because it works well in any environment. However, with that said, you hit on a good point because I know quite a few guys who carry strong side hip, but they don't like how that works in the car. So they actually will keep with them when they're traveling a cross draw holster, which most people are opposed to. I don't like cross draw as a main carry method, and these guys don't either, but they use it specifically for the car. So, those are things to consider. Now, again, though, it's on you. It's not in the car, right?
Right.
So if
Right.
you have to get up and run, maybe now it's not in your primary carry position, but at least it's on you. So I think that's a big improvement. I'll throw out another thing to consider. Generally, I don't like ankle carry. I use it only on the rare occasion that I carry a second gun on me. Ankle carry works great for in the car. It's very accessible when you're actually in the car. And when we talk about this kind of thing, like heightened threat of civil unrest, where you might have to bail out of the car, I think
Yeah.
a second handgun on your body is a very good idea, right?
That's
Probably.
very interesting. I haven't thought about that since I was a cop as a young
Mhm.
man and carried a backup snubby on the inside of my left ankle.
Then
And
that's what I opt
yeah,
for. Yep, that's what
yeah,
I opt
it
for.
makes good
Snubby on
sense.
the ankle. And when we start talking about these kind of things where if you have to bail out of the vehicle with a big crowd, you're going to want to be non-violent and just walk along with them and not get assaulted. But, God forbid you're in the worst case scenario where you get assaulted by a lot of people. I would submit that if you lose control of your main handgun, a
Yeah.
backup handgun on your ankle is probably a lot more valuable than an AR-15 in a backpack at that point.
Yeah. I'm sitting here reevaluating a lot of stuff for myself. This is such a valuable conversation that we're having because I'm sitting there thinking about, okay, I need to reevaluate my carry position in my vehicle. I do have an IFAC, an individual first aid kit in my truck. It's always in the same place, but I can't reach it from my passenger seat.
That's a
Maybe
great
I need
point.
to resituate that. So I'm going to reevaluate that. And my phone, my communications. Often my phone's just sitting in my console, plugged into my um, what's called CarPlay in my truck, so I can see my stuff on my screen or answer my phone. And I'm thinking, man, maybe I need to keep that phone, on my person, just use my Bluetooth connection so that if something does happen, or if I get in a wreck and run off the road,
It's
my
a great
my
point.
phone flies into the floorboard and I can't get to it. So I'm thinking, I'm going to carry my phone on my person from now on in my vehicle for that reason as well. And man, you talk about some good tangible information today. I am definitely going to reevaluate some of the things that I'm doing, how I'm carrying my EDC gear. Um, I do think I'm somewhat prepared in my vehicle for these situations. I would like to recap. There's such a lot of information we covered today. We talked about awareness regarding active killer threats. Not we call them active killer. Why do we call them active killer instead of active shooter?
Well, glad you hit on that, right? Because while the typical paradigm for domestic violence within the continental United States falls into the active shooter paradigm, we're a gun culture. So our sickos, when they act out, typically will shoot a place up. There's been use of explosives, and I'll throw out another one, vehicle attacks, which are much more common in Europe and the Middle East and throughout Asia, actually, than they are here, but we've had them here as well. This is another thing that should go into your awareness. If you're in crowded places on the streets, don't sit, for example, at tables at a restaurant that are right exposed to oncoming traffic. It might not even be anything malicious. There's plenty of times where you have some drunk driver who goes off the rails, right, and runs into the front of a restaurant. So even from that standpoint, just be cognizant of how vulnerable you are to vehicles. If you're at big public events like the county fair, whatever, right? How accessible is it to vehicles? Because we've seen terrorists use vehicles many times. In
Yeah,
fact, one of the single worst terror attacks in history was Nice, France, where that guy ran a
that's
box
right.
truck through the crowd. He killed 89 people, right? So be cognizant of explosives and the use of vehicles.
Yeah, that's right. We talked about being alert to people that don't look right, the unseasonable, heavy clothing, large bags, leaving bags or packages in places. Talk about vehicles, being alerted to vehicle attacks in your streets. I actually made notes while you were talking. Staying alert to your local news. Again, why do we want to do that?
You want to have your finger on the pulse of what is happening, what can cause issues, right? Political upheaval, or, again, a high profile police shooting. Unfortunately, that's the new thing for the past decade or two, right? That people really react to those events. So if something like that has recently happened, you should immediately realize that you are in a much more heightened state of you need to be in a heightened state of awareness for these possible mobs that materialize.
Yeah, you bet. You also brought up hotspot. Yeah, those hotspots for demonstrations, the courthouses, the state and federally owned buildings, knowing where those scheduled demonstrations are going to be, so you can avoid those. Avoidance is the big thing, and preparing for those escalated threats. Carrying those additional tools on your body. Can you get to them in your vehicle? What a great conversation we had about that. Backup guns, spare ammo, medical communications. Communications, very, very important. I love my sling bag. I have a sling bag that I carry almost on a daily basis that's got some daily EDC, that stuff that I keep in it. And the last thing I want to hit on, Sal, is having that plan with your family or your group of people that you're going to be with. Let's talk to that before we close today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very important. Again, if we're dealing with times of increased danger. But even with that said, I almost hesitate to always encourage people, oh, be especially alert now, because we all know how these things happen, right? The domestic threats that we have are realistically over the next year or two, we may not see any kind of terror activity, but the domestic threat is always there and always possible. So we can never let our guards down, right? So the family plan, we talked about this a little bit with the last show. Have the plan if you're in big public crowded places where the link up point would be. I really encourage people to discuss with their families not linking up at the vehicle in the parking lot, because if we do see the use of explosives, that's been a strategy we've seen in Asia and Europe, where they will funnel people out with gunfire only to detonate an explosive in the parking lot. Okay, have a link up place that's clear of the event that you're at. In terms of dealing with crowds, have the discussion beforehand with the family. If we had to leave the vehicle, here's what we're going to do. Typically, what you want to do, if you're in an open highway, you just want to get out of that vehicle and make distance as quickly as you can. Kids, small kids always make things much more difficult, right? I always remind parents with small kids, you're way more likely to have to use deadly force when you have young children than if you're by yourself, because there's a lot of things you could just run away from. That, try that with a couple of toddlers, right? Running away. You
Yeah.
might have to resort to force. If you're in a more urban environment, discuss with them, hey, if this happened, we're going to get out of the car and we get our backs to a wall. That's always a good strategy, a storefront if you're in an alley, so that people can do violent things to you from behind, and then skirt along the wall and get clear of the crowd. So just have those kind of discussions. And again, you don't have to terrorize your family and make them paranoid with fear. Oh, we have to be afraid all the time. Absolutely not. I always tell people having a plan should lessen your fear and your apprehension, because now you have a plan which puts you that much more ahead of the game. So just have these kind of discussions, have a family plan to link up after an event if something bad happens, and have the family plan. What would you do if we had to egress the vehicle, which honestly is a very good plan to have anyway. After a wreck, the vehicle catches on fire, having a plan, this is what we would do, this is where we would meet, etc.
Yeah. Wow. Great information, Sal. We really appreciate it. Appreciate your input. Look forward to having you back again. Really tangible information, tangible tips for urban survival. I mean, things that we can apply to our everyday lives. Guys, make sure you follow Sal, reflexhandgun.com, all his socials. I'm sure you'll see Sal again with us soon. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you hit those buttons, like, subscribe, comment, and share. Hit that link and become a Survival Dispatch Insider. Stay safe, everybody. We will see you next time.